The Hugginses had received a number of telephone calls in answer to their advertisement. A man had seen a dog that sounded like Ribsy running down Broadway, but he did not know where the dog had gone. A lady had been feeding a stray spotted dog for over a month, and she would really like to get rid of him. A boy called to say he knew a couple of dogs that sounded like Ribsy, and how much was the reward. Another lady called to say she didn't know anything about Ribsy, but she did have 5 perfectly adorable puppies, and she would be glad to give Henry one. It was late in the evening, after the advertisement had been running for several days, that Mr. Dingley, the father of the 4 girls and George, telephoned to say that he had read the notice and that he was sure it must have been Ribsy his family had picked up in the parking lot area at the shopping center. He told the tale of finding Ribsy, of the bubble bath, and of Ribsy's disappearance into the dusk. He was sorry he had not called sooner, but 3 of his children had come down with chicken pox and he had been busy. Bubble bath! Henry was disgusted when his father relayed the story to him. A bunch of dumb girls giving Ribsy a bubble bath, for Pete's sake. No wonder he ran away. At least we know the direction in which Ribsy went, said his mother. That's something. We'll let the ad run a while longer and see if it won't bring results, said Mr. Huggins. Bubble bath, muttered Henry. Bubble bath! By the time the advertisement had run for 3 weeks, the Hugginses had received several more calls and had gone to look at 3 different dogs. None of them was Ribsy. Well, Henry, I don't like to say this, said Mr. Huggins at last, but I think we might as well stop the ad. Henry nodded. He could not think of anything to say. He was sure Ribsy had to be someplace, that someone must have known him, but that someone was quite plainly not going to answer an advertisement in a newspaper. And why should he? Ribsy was such a good dog, anyone would want to keep him. By now, Ribsy was back inside the city limits. He had learned from his own neighborhood on Klickitat Street that many people fed their pets outside the back door or in the garage. This made his search for food fairly easy as he continued his journey. He had only to investigate backyards, and sooner or later his nose led him to a dish with a few crumbs of food, or if he was lucky, to a whole bowlful. Unfortunately, most of the people whose yards he passed through kept cats. He gulped down several meals of rather fishy cat food. Workmen eating lunches out of lunch buckets were another source of food. Workmen tearing up the streets, workmen repairing telephone wires, workmen putting new roofs on old houses. All of them were glad to share a corner of a sandwich or a bite of a donut with a friendly dog. Hunger was not Ribsy's problem. He was no longer sure of the way toward home. None of the streets he followed seemed to lead to Klickitat Street. He searched for something familiar, something that would lead him home to Henry Huggins. He trod along the sidewalk, looking up at all the people he met, hoping that one of them would turn out to be a member of his family. They were always strangers, but Ribsy was not easily discouraged. He continued his search until he came to a mailman waiting for a bus. Ribsy, who had often followed the Klickitat Street mailman on his rounds, was delighted to see someone who looked a little bit familiar. He pranced right over to the bus stop and wagged his tail. "Hello, Pooch," said the mailman. Encouraged, Ribsy sat down beside the mailman, who obligingly petted him. That, as far as Ribsy was concerned, was that. He would follow the mailman, who was sure to lead him to the Huggins' house. When the bus stopped and the mailman swung aboard and sat down, Ribsy scrambled after him and flopped down at his feet. "Hey," said the driver, "that dog can't ride on the bus." "He's not my dog," said the mailman. "Well, somebody get him out of here fast," said the driver. "I got a schedule to make." A high school boy was glad to help. He seized Ribsy by the collar and pulled. Ribsy stiffened his legs and dug his toenails onto the floor of the bus. He was not going to go. The boy pulled so hard at his collar he began to choke. "Don't you hurt that poor dog," cried an old lady from the back of the bus. "Take your hands off him this instant, or I shall report you to the SPCA." The boy let go of the collar. "Wait, I have an idea," said the mailman. He slipped the strap of his mail pouch off his shoulder, got up, and walked quickly down the aisle. Ribsy was not going to be left behind. He trotted right down the aisle and followed the mailman out the rear door of the bus. The mailman then surprised him by sprinting to the front door and jumping into the bus once more. Before Ribsy could jump in after him, the door was shut in his face and the bus drove off in a particularly smelly cloud of exhaust. Ribsy had never had a mailman treat him this way before. He did not know what to think. At first he tried running after the bus, but the smell of its exhaust soon discouraged him. He wandered along the sidewalk until he saw 3 girls carrying brown paper bags. Instantly Ribsy's spirits rose. Here was a familiar sight. Girls with lunches and paper bags were sure to lead him to school, and there he would find Henry. He followed happily along behind the girls, just close enough to catch a whiff of their lunches. Tuna fish, peanut butter, and pot roast. "Don't look now, but there is a dog following us," said one of the girls, and giggled. The other two thought this was very funny. They all giggled and glanced back at Ribsy, who trotted along minding his own business. Sure enough, just as Ribsy expected, the three girls led him to a familiar place, a two-story red brick school surrounded by a fenced-in asphalt playground. His spirits rose even higher. Henry must be around somewhere. After noticing that the three girls left their lunches on a bench before they went off to play hopscotch, Ribsy put his nose to the ground and ran around the schoolyard, searching for the scent of Henry Huggins. He picked up many scents of boys and sneakers, but none of them had the exact scent of Henry. Ribsy also picked up the scent of the pot roast sandwich once more, and this time he helped himself to the lunch bag. There was no use letting a perfectly good piece of meat go to waste when he had eaten so much fishy cat food lately. "Look!" squealed the owner of the pot roast sandwich. "That dog has my lunch!" The chase was on. Everyone, boys and girls, big and little, chased Ribsy. He loved it. He hadn't had so much fun since he had been lost. He ducked and dodged with the brown paper bag in his mouth. Sometimes, when he was far enough ahead, he dropped the bag a second and stood panting, with a laughing look on his face, as if to say, "Catch me if you can." Then, when someone almost reached him, he snatched at the lunch and ducked and dodged some more. Finally, the yard teacher blew a whistle that hurt Ribsy's ears, and everyone stopped chasing him. "Here, doggy," coaxed the yard teacher. "Nice doggy." Ribsy eyed the teacher warily, ready to run if she should decide to chase him. Instead, she approached him slowly with her hand extended. "Nice doggy," she said. "Give us the lunch. That's the boy." She was so friendly, Ribsy let her pet him and take the lunch. "The poor dog is hungry," said the owner of the undamaged pot roast sandwich. "I'll give him something out of my lunch," someone said, and a dozen lunch bags were opened. "Now, children, you know dogs are not allowed on the school grounds," the yard teacher spoke in a mild voice, because, after all, Ribsy was such a nice, friendly dog. No one seemed to hear her. Ribsy found himself being offered pieces of sandwiches, potato chips, carrot sticks, raisins, and cookies. He accepted the most appetizing bits to the delight of the givers, while those who brought their lunches in the cafeteria petted him and wished they had something to feed him. Ribsy could tell he was going to like this place. When the bell rang, Ribsy went right into the school with the boys and girls and into the nearest classroom, which happened to belong to Mrs. Sonchek's second grade. He looked around the room at the desks and blackboards and at an empty aquarium on a ledge below the window. None of this was especially interesting to him. Then he walked into one door of the cloakroom at the back, sniffed the lunches and wraps, and walked out the other door. Satisfied with his investigation, he flopped down near the cloakroom door and laid his nose on his paws. He had spent the night dozing in a cold garage and was glad of a chance to nap in a warm, dry place that smelled pleasantly of sneakers, lunch bags, and boys and girls. The 30 boys and girls in Mrs. Sonchek's second grade took their seats while Ribsy dozed off. Suddenly he was awakened by the sound of 30 pairs of feet sliding out from under their desk and 30 boys and girls standing up. Everyone was going someplace, and Ribsy was about to be left behind. He jumped to his feet, too. "I pledge allegiance," began the class, "to the flag of the United States—" Oh, they weren't going anywhere after all. After the flag salute, the class sat down, all but the 2 boys nearest Ribsy, who petted him in such a way that Ribsy knew he had somehow pleased them. A girl raised her hand. "Yes, Penny," said the teacher. "Mrs. Sonchek, there's a dog back here. And when we stood up for the Pledge of Allegiance, he stood up too." Penny was pleased to have announced this news to the class. Everyone turned in his seat to admire such a smart animal. "It must be a very patriotic dog," said Mrs. Sonchek pleasantly. "And now, Danny, will you please take him outdoors?" Reluctantly, with several backward glances, Ribsy allowed Danny Yaxley to lead him outdoors, where the asphalt was cold and unfriendly after the warm floor of the schoolroom. Ribsy looked sadly at the door that closed behind him, and the minute the milkman came to deliver the boxes of milk cartons, he slipped inside, returned to the second grade room, and flopped down by the cloakroom door. Penny waved her hand. "Mrs. Sonchek, that dog is back." "Keep quiet," whispered the boys. Mrs. Sonchek merely said, "The dog is not bothering anyone, Penny. Pay no attention to him." Mrs. Sonchek did not like to waste classroom time. There were so many interesting and important things to learn in the second grade. That was how Ribsy became a member of the second grade. He spent his nights in garages whose owners had left the doors open. In the morning he went to the school with neighborhood children who fed him bits of their lunches and in a day or two began to bring him an occasional dog biscuit. When he was thirsty he had only to go to the drinking fountain in the schoolyard, and some boys always turned it on for him. After he had managed to lap the spurting water with his tongue, the boy usually had a drink too. Following the flag salute, when he was sure of being petted if he stood up, he dozed all morning, going out at recess with the rest of the class. At lunchtime he got in line and went to the cafeteria, where he finished the sandwiches of those who asked him to, except peanut butter sandwiches. These Ribsy would sniff and politely refuse. Peanut butter stuck to his teeth. After lunch, he lay at the back of the room with his nose on his paws, waiting for school to be out so that he could play with anyone who wanted to play with a friendly dog. It was a pleasant life. This had gone on for several days. Then one day at lunchtime, Ribsy lined up as usual and went to the cafeteria. He was very well behaved, stayed with his class, and sat down beside a table where Mrs. Sonchek's bag lunchers were eating while the rest of the class lined up to buy their lunches. He was licking the remains of a crunched-up potato chip from the floor when he became aware of a man standing over him. "And who is our friend?" asked Mr. Woody, the principal. "A dog," said Bill Amato. "A nice dog," said Penny Moise. Ribsy was pleased when the principal stooped to pet him. "Whose dog is he?" asked Mr. Woody. "Search me," said Pete Schultman. "He comes to school every day. He lives around here someplace. See, he has a collar." He pointed to the red collar Mrs. Frowley had bought for Ribsy. "I know," said Mr. Woody. "I have seen him. Perhaps he belongs to someone who is away at work all day. From the fancy red collar, I would guess he belongs to a lady." "Oh, please let him stay," begged Penny. "He's an awfully good dog. He even stands for the Pledge of Allegiance." Mrs. Sonchek's bag lunchers nodded. Ribsy wanted to please this man, so he held up his left paw. Mr. Woody smiled and shook hands. "Well, fellow, I see you are a southpaw." Ribsy, always glad of attention, stood up and wagged his tail. "It looks as if Mrs. Sonchek's room has a mascot," said Mr. Woody, "as long as he behaves himself." Mrs. Sonchek's bag lunchers beamed at the principal. "Our mascot is always good," said Penny earnestly, and the others nodded. The week went smoothly until Friday arrived. Friday in Mrs. Sonchek's room was show and tell day. It started like any other day. Mrs. Sonchek looked around the class and noted that Danny Yaxley was absent. Ribsy stood up with the rest of the class for the flag salute and then flopped down for a nap. "Does anyone have anything to share with the class this morning?" asked Mrs. Sonchek. Kathleen Adelson came to the front of the room to show off her doll, which had a pair of real little sunglasses. The boys looked scornful. Pete Schultman showed a tool chest he got for his birthday. He said his mother would not let him use the hammer or saw in the house. The boys looked interested. They wished they had tool chests too. Philip Gorberg had just finished telling about the time he was riding down a hill with his father and the brakes of the car refused to work, when the door of the classroom opened. Danny Yaxley came in with his mother, who was carrying a sheet of corrugated cardboard and a wooden box with holes bored in the sides. It was a rule in Mrs. Sonchek's room that anyone who brought a pet for show and tell had to bring his mother too. The mother's job was to take the pet home. "I'm sorry we're late, Mrs. Sonchek," said Mrs. Yaxley, who looked as if she had not taken time to put on her lipstick. "Danny insisted on bringing a squirrel for show and tell. The cage was too big to carry, and I had to stop and bore holes in this box, and, well, I'm not very good at this kind of thing." All the boys thought this was funny. They were sure they would be good at boring holes. The class was excited. They were going to get to see a real-life squirrel right there in school. "My squirrel is gnawing on the box." Danny's eyes were bright with excitement. "A live squirrel!" exclaimed Mrs. Sonchek, smiling bravely. "But how can we see it in a wooden box?" "Danny said the aquarium in the classroom was empty, and we could put Frisky in it with this cardboard over the top." Mrs. Yaxley looked apologetic. The whole thing was not her idea. "Yes," said Danny enthusiastically, "Frisky will look real nice in the aquarium." The class was delighted. A squirrel in an aquarium. "All right, Danny," Mrs. Sonchek gave her permission. "Sorry to take up so much classroom time," apologized Danny's mother as she put the wooden box down inside the aquarium. "Now, Danny, hold the cardboard over the top and clap it down quickly when I take my hands out." She slid the lid of the box. Ribsy, who had opened one eye when he heard the murmurs of excitement from the children, caught a whiff of squirrel. He didn't even stop to think. He automatically jumped to his feet, barking. "Oh!" Startled, Mrs. Yaxley gave a little scream and jumped away from the aquarium. She had not noticed Ribsy. Danny dropped the cardboard. A gray squirrel with a bushy tail darted out of the box and sprang up on the edge of the aquarium. Ribsy put his paws up on the counter and barked furiously. That squirrel did not belong in here. Frisky chattered and ran along the counter below the windows with Ribsy following on the floor. The class laughed and shouted. "Catch him!" cried Mrs. Yaxley. A boy grabbed Ribsy by the collar. Ribsy pawed the air with his front feet and strained at his collar until he choked. Mrs. Sonchek pounded on her desk with a ruler. "Class!" she cried. "Class, please!" How could any class be quiet with a squirrel loose in the room? Nothing that interesting had happened since Billy Amato had brought a live clam to school. Frisky jumped to the top of a pile of supplementary readers in the front of the room, and from there he took a flying leap to the staff that supported the flag in a bracket above the blackboard. Ribsy broke loose and ran under the flag. He put his paws in the chalk tray and made as much noise as he could. He would show that squirrel who belonged in this room. Frisky ran lightly up to the end of the staff that held the flag and scolded Ribsy. This infuriated Ribsy and delighted the class. If this kept up, There'll be no time at all for arithmetic. "People!" cried Mrs. Sonchek, banging on the desk with a ruler. "People, please!" And the door opened, and Mr. Woody, the principal, entered, followed by Mrs. Hildebrand, the school nurse. At the sight of the principal, the class became a little quieter. Not much, but a little. "I'm terribly sorry," said Mrs. Yaxley, wringing her hands. "I didn't mean to take up so much classroom time." Mr. Woody frowned at the class. "Quiet!" he ordered. "What's going on in here?" This time the class obeyed, but Ribsy did not. Neither did Frisky, who flirted his tail and scolded. Mr. Woody grasped the situation. "Someone hold the dog," said the principal. 3 boys ran to the front of the room. One tackled Ribsy, and the other 2 grabbed his collar. "Mrs. Sonchek, get me a jacket," directed the principal. "Here, take mine." Danny pulled off his jacket and handed it to Mr. Woody. Ribsy, straining on his collar, panted hoarsely. The boys were spoiling his fun. "Quiet, everyone," repeated the principal. He walked to the front of the room and stepped up on one of the chairs in the reading circle. "Now, Mrs. Sonchek, when I lift the flag down, you throw the jacket over the squirrel." Ribsy made strangling noises while the class, quiet at last, waited breathlessly to see if the principal's plan would work. This was so much better than a live clam. Slowly the principal reached for the flagstaff, and slowly he lifted it from its bracket above the blackboard. The squirrel stopped chattering. Slowly, slowly, the principal lowered the staff. Never had Ribsy wanted to leap at anything as much as he wanted to leap at that squirrel. Slowly, slowly, Mrs. Sonchek lifted Danny's jacket. Scolded Frisky. Ribsy, who would accept anything from people, even a bubble bath and a little straw hat and spectacles, resented the sassiness of that squirrel. He growled. Frisky leaped from the flagstaff. Mrs. Sonchek tried to throw the jacket over him, but it fell empty to the floor while Frisky ran lightly along the chalk tray, hopped to the floor, and ran under the teacher's desk. Mrs. Sonchek picked up the jacket and prepared to try again, while Mrs. Yaxley and Mrs. Hildebrand took jackets from the cloakroom and prepared to stalk the angry squirrel. Mr. Woody replaced the flagstaff in its bracket and armed himself for the chase with the yardstick Mrs. Sonchek kept on the chalk tray to use as a pointer. When some of the boys started for the cloakroom to get their jackets too, Mr. Woody said sternly, "In your seats, class." There were enough people running around already. Mr. Woody rattled the ruler under Mrs. Sonchek's desk. Frisky darted out and ran down an aisle. The 3 women threw jackets and missed, while Ribsy barked and strained at his collar. The girls pulled their feet up from the floor. The boys sat on their desks to get a better view. "Mr. Woody," said one of the boys who was holding Ribsy, "why don't we let our mascot chase him? I bet he could catch him." "No," said one half of the class, mostly girls who felt sorry for the squirrel. "Yes," said the other half, mostly boys who wanted to see a dog catch a squirrel. "Don't you dare stick that dog on my squirrel," said Danny to the boy who was holding Ribsy's collar. "Class!" cried Mrs. Sonchek. The squirrel skittered into one of the cloakroom doors. Naturally, the whole class had to turn around to face the back of the room. Ribsy could hardly stand it. If they would just let him go, he could show that squirrel a thing or two. "Now we've got him," said Mr. Woody. "Line up with jackets at the other door, and I'll go in with the yardstick and chase him out." The 3 women stood at one door of the cloakroom with jackets aimed, while Mr. Woody marched in the other door with the yardstick. Thumping and whacking could be heard from the cloakroom. "Look out! Here he comes!" yelled the principal. The teacher, the mother, and the school nurse crouched with the jackets. There was a flash of gray fur, and all 3 pounced. "I've got him!" cried Mrs. Hildebrand, the school nurse, who was on her knees clutching a wiggling jacket. "Quick, roll him up," said Mrs. Yaxley. She took the rolled-up squirrel and stuffed it, jacket and all, into the wooden box. Ribsy felt the boy's hold on his collar relax. He made pathetic coughing sounds. "Hey, that's my jacket," said Billy Amato. "I'll bring it back before lunch period," promised Mrs. Yaxley. "My mother isn't going to like it if that squirrel chews up my jacket," said Billy. Mrs. Yaxley looked as if she had had a difficult morning. "If he does, I'll buy you a new one," she said in desperation. Turning to the principal, she added apologetically, "I'm terribly sorry to have taken up so much classroom time." "But won't the squirrel smother?" asked Penny Moise. "He's not rolled up that tight," answered Danny's mother, who was in a hurry to get the squirrel home to his cage. "Never did get to tell about my squirrel," complained Danny. "Never mind, Danny, you showed him. That is enough." His mother spoke sharply before she escaped from the classroom with Frisky safe inside the box. It was all over. The class slid back into their seats and waited to see what Mr. Woody would say about the interesting time they had had when they were supposed to be learning arithmetic. The principal came to the front of the room and gave Ribsy a stern look. Then he faced the expectant class. "Boys and girls," Mr. Woody sounded very serious, "dogs are not allowed on the school grounds. We all know that." The class looked guilty. They all knew this, but it was Mr. Woody himself who had called the dog their mascot. And I'm afraid I made a mistake in making an exception. Mr. Woody looked once more at Ribsy. Now Ribsy looked guilty. He understood that he had done something wrong, but he was not sure what it was. He thought dogs were supposed to chase squirrels and get rid of them. But this dog looked like such a friendly dog, continued Mr. Woody, and he seemed so well behaved that I overlooked the rule. Ribsy waved his tail wistfully to show that he did not mean to do anything wrong, that he really was a friendly dog. Now we know, said Mr. Woody, that a dog does not make a good mascot and that the rule is right. This should be a lesson for all of us. I'm afraid the dog will have to go. Oh, the class made a sad sound. They loved their mascot and did not want him to go. Neither did they want this morning, which had been such fun, turned into a lesson in obeying rules. When Mr. Woody looked at Ribsy, the dog stopped waving his tail and let it droop. He knew he had not succeeded in making everything all right again. He hung his head and looked dejected. "Come on, boy," said Mr. Woody kindly, and took hold of Ribsy's collar. "Come along with me." One of the girls in the front row began to cry. The whole class waved, and those in the last row of seats patted Ribsy as Mr. Woody led him out of the room. Mr. Woody did not let go of Ribsy's collar outside the classroom or even outside the building. He kept a tight grip until he had led Ribsy outside the metal fence that surrounded the schoolyard. Only then did he let go of Ribsy. He slammed the gate with a clang and said, "Goodbye, fellow." Ribsy understood one thing. He was no longer welcome here. This made him unhappy, and when Ribsy was unhappy he seemed to droop all over. He took a few steps away from the gate, stopped, and looked hopefully back. Maybe the man would change his mind and call him so that he could come running. The man had not changed his mind. "Go home," he said firmly, but kindly. Go home. That was a command that Ribsy understood. He had heard it many times on Klickitat Street when he had run through the neighbors' flower beds. He had heard it when Henry did not want him to chase after the car. Now the words reminded him of Henry Huggins and the familiar street with green lawns and trees. "Go home," repeated the principal. After one more sad backward glance, Ribsy started walking. He wanted to obey the man. He wanted to go home, but he did not know where home was, and there was no way he could make the man understand.